What's going on, guys? So today we have a challenge. Why am I shouting? You know what the challenge is?
Yes.
I challenge you to say Mr. Beast, the very famous YouTuber, 1,000 times.
I'm up for the challenge.
You heard the kid, he's up to the challenge. So this is just like an homage to when Mr. Beast said
PewDiePie 1,000 times.
Actually, I think he said it more than that. Close to 100,000 times. But who's counting anyway? Do you want to say 100,000 times, Mr. Beast? Or you want to say 1,000?
1,000.
I think we should say 100,000.
No,
You have enough time.
1,000. 1,000.
Alright, so let's not waste any time. Let's start doing it, okay?
1,000 times.
Okay, let's go. Ready? And go.
Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast.
27.
Okay. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast.
50.
Mr. Beast, 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 yes, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast.
100!
Yes!
Yeah, only how many more to go?
I'm like,
A million.
oh yeah, 900.
That's all?
Yeah.
Oh, you're good in math. I can't fool you.
900 plus 100
So 100
equals 1,000.
Go.
Okay, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast.
40? 140.
Okay, 140. Okay, good. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. 150.
150. Are you counting as well?
Yes.
Oh, you're pretty good.
Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. 160.
I'll count. You just do Mr. Beast.
Okay. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast.
200.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's go. Okay. Ready, set, go. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Shout out to Mr. Beast and subscribe to Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast.
250.
Yes! I'm so excited. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast,
280, 281. Keep going.
Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast.
300.
Yes. Ready, set, go. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Beast, Mr. 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 Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast,
400.
Yes.
Almost.
400 and 600. 400, 600,
600 more.
6, 1,000, 1,000 water.
Don't stop.
Alright. Wait, what was I saying?
Mr. Beast.
Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr.
400.
Yes.
Did I say 400 before?
Yeah, you did. 500.
So we have 500 now.
Yes.
Just checking to see if you're paying attention. He's paying attention.
Okay, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. That water gives me energy, so I can think quicker. Mr. Beast, 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 Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Beast.
One. Keep going.
Mr. Beast.
Two.
Mr. Beast, 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 Mr.
600.
600.
Yeah, 400 more. Can you make it? You
Yes.
sure?
I can totally pass this challenge.
Let's go. 600.
Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr.
700.
Yes! If I win if I go to 1,000, that means you have to give me all of your money.
All right, let's do that. I don't have a lot of money, so I don't know what you're talking about.
No, you have to give me all of your money.
Okay, let's go.
Okay.
700 and counting.
Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Come on, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, come on. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 come on, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, come, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, shout out the like to Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast.
800.
Yes!
How do you feel?
Awesome, 200 more, 200 more.
200.
200 more. Okay. Ready, set, go. Wait, hang on. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast.
Do you know when you say Mr. Beast, it sounds like you're saying Beastmaster? You're
What?
saying Mr. Beast quickly. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. That sounds like Beastmaster.
Beastmaster? I'm saying Mr. Beast, not Beastmaster.
Okay.
If it's at Mr. Beastmaster, it would be kind of like correct.
Okay, let's go. Continue.
Okay, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast.
900!
Yes! 100 more!
Finish line is around the corner.
Yes.
Alright. Let's go.
Now I have more energy. Ready, set, go.
Alright, but don't knock the camera.
Okay.
Okay.
Ready, set, go.
Mr.
Wait.
Beast.
Oh yeah, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Beast, Mr. 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 Beast.
1,000, but let's do 100 more because we're awesome.
What?
Yeah.
No, no, no.
Let's go, let's do it.
No.
You're not up to the challenge?
No, you said 1,000, then you change your mind?
Let's do 100 more.
Oh, come on. Okay, I accept your challenge.
Okay, good. Because you have no choice, because you have to do it.
Fine.
Mr. Beast.
Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Wait, how much is that?
Keep going.
Okay, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. What's that?
Keep going.
Wait, what?
36. Keep going. 37.
Wait, okay.
Keep going. Keep going.
Okay. Oh, wait, hang on. Wait,
Mr.
oh yeah,
Beast.
Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast.
1,200. You did 200 more. You see, you did it.
Yes.
You're the beast.
But wait, who's that behind?
Who? What do you mean? Oh, that's Darth. He's been there all the time.
No, wait, he's my enemy. Remember on the Star Wars game?
Oh, okay. But why is he an enemy?
Cause
I
he's
thought he was your bud.
he wasn't. Remember, I was fighting him on the last
Oh, you mean
video?
when you're playing Luke Skywalker versus Darth Vader?
Yes.
Okay.
Darth Vader, why are you here?
I was just chilling. But anyway, guys, this is what his idea was. He loves Mr. Beast. And Mr. Beast, please give us a shout out.
Yes.
Why do you want Mr. Beast to give you a shout out? Because you love Mr. Beast.
I love Mr. Beast. And please subscribe, hit the bell, notification, and also subscribe.
And the big like button.
Yes.
You know that big like button?
Yep. Or you want to give a thumbs down? Bad luck.
What? Oh, and please watch the video, because the more you like, the more you watch the video, the more YouTube is gonna
Yes.
send this video out
Send
to other
us
people to watch as well. We want all the
videos.
people to see this video.
Yeah.
So the more you watch, the better it is for us.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Thank you for watching.
See you
And
next
Mr.
time.
Beast, I hope you see this video.
Thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye.
See you next time, guys. Till next time.
Peace.
You want to do the camera thing, or should I?
What?
Let's do it together.
Okay.